Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sela Social Studies. Okay, so today we're going to be covering kind of what's going on during the Civil War, during Reconstruction, going into the 1880s. That's why I kind of kept this separately, because it's also dealing with not everything on the East Coast. You have to remember, Reconstruction, Civil War, the majority of that happened on the East Coast, the North and the South, that eastern part of the United States. And now we're going to be talking about moving out west and who was moving out west. So why did people move out west between the 1850s and the 1880s? The answers seem pretty simple. Number one, it was our manifest destiny, right? However, one needs to remember the main cause of the largest migration of humans to the Western Hemisphere, like kind of in the history of the world, was the California gold rush. So those are the two main reasons why we move out west. Number one, it was our manifest destiny. Number two, miners started traveling out to California after gold was found in Sutter's Mill. It was because of this mining boom and this gold boom that millions of Americans moved out west. So the American frontier finally reached the Pacific Ocean when California was added to the Union in the Compromise of 1850. Along the way, settlers would build homes, ranches, farms, stuff like that. The railroads expanded west to bring Western goods to the Eastern markets, and mining companies shipped gold and silver east from these Western mines. And there was an abundance of movement and human environmental interaction all along the way. So between the years of 1550 and 1580, mining became a big business with discoveries of large deposits of precious metals, such as this one here, the Comstock Lode, which was a huge find of gold and silver in Nevada. The total production of ore extracted and milled in the Comstock district between 1859 and about June 30th, 1880 was 7 million tons, and the peak production from this Comstock area occurred in 1877 when the mines producing over $14 million of gold and $21 million in silver that year, which today that would amount to be about $305 million combined. So boom towns were fast-growing towns that quickly grew when a mine opened up, and it often dispersed after the mine closed. A lot of people moved in when they found gold, and they just built all these saloons and hotels and motels and everything like that, and restaurants. And then once that mine was shut down, everybody left, and that is when it became a ghost town. So mining was dangerous business. The equipment was unsafe. Miners had to breathe hot, stuffy air that caused lung disease. Poorly planned explosions, fires, cave-ins often killed or injured many of these miners. And these miners would actually carry a canary in a bird cage down into the mine with them. And if the canary died, the miners knew at that point in time that the air was unbreathable and they needed to evacuate. So you had miners going out west in record numbers. Who else was going out west? They were not the only ones to migrate to the west in the 1800s. The wide open plains of the Midwest drew lots of attention from cowboys and cattle ranchers. With such an abundance of that prairie grass out there and that flat grazing plain land out there, these cattle ranchers saw opportunities to raise and herd their cattle in that area. Many more Americans were eating beef products, and the open prairies of the Midwest was a perfect place for men to raise cattle. The increasing demand for beef, because Americans were beef eaters, helped the cattle industry boom. And these cattle ranchers in Texas, named Texas Rangers, they drove herds of cattle numbering in the millions from Texas up to Abilene, Kansas, to be slaughtered and shipped east on the railroad. So between 1870 and 1890, this cattle ranching spread across the Great Plains, creating what we call the Cattle Kingdom that stretched from southern Texas to Canada. The area that ranchers grazed these huge herds on public land was called the open range. And these Texas Rangers that rode the open range were called cowboys. So cowboys were workers who took care of the ranchers' cattle. They were glorified in Hollywood movies as heroes of the West. And while some of this may be true, in reality they were just hardworking and brave men. They borrowed many techniques from the vaqueros, who were Mexican ranch hands, and one of the most important duties was the cattle drive. This cattle drive consisted of multiple routes from Texas to Kansas, but the Chisholm Trail on that picture right there was probably one of the most popular route for herding these vast herds of cattle. These drives would last for approximately 800 miles and roughly 2 months. So these cattle towns that these cowboys spent the night in on those trails were often rough and violent. So they would move these huge herds of cattle, like you see in these pictures up here, from Texas all the way up to Kansas. And like I said, it would take a couple of months, and they had to stay along the way. So what really got in the way of a lot of this herding of cattle? Well, the growth of the railroad was interfering with the cattle trails. It sometimes cut them in half. I mean, that was a long, single, trail that without being cut in half was bad enough. But the railroad would sometimes interfere with cattle trails. Sometimes, the herds would be, over the track, and the train would get out there and it would have to stop. So it was really bad. That was one of the biggest ones, but it was not the worst ones, and it was not what ended the cattle kingdom. So you had a couple things that ended the cattle kingdom. Competition became more common in the Midwest as farmers began to raise more cattle. The loss of prairie grass brought on by the huge herds that traveled on there, and barbed wire ended the cattle kingdom. But you have to remember this: because the cattle kingdom relied heavily on those wide open prairies and an abundance of grass and feed for the cattle, it was actually the invention of the barbed wire that brought an end, and actually an abrupt end, to the cattle kingdom. So if you travel out west right now, you will see these huge acreages of land that are just surrounded by the barbed wire. Now, some cowboys would try to cut it and get through it, but you had the cattle that was running up to the barbed wire. They were getting injured. They were slicing themselves. They were getting stuck. They were dying. So even though railroad was an issue, competition was an issue, and the loss of prairie grass was an issue, it was barbed wire that was the ultimate end to the cattle drive.